What if I told you that saving JFK's life might have been the worst thing you could do for America? That preventing those fatal shots in Dallas could have led to nuclear war, the collapse of civil rights, and a timeline so dark that even the most twisted alternate history novels wouldn't dare imagine it. Today we're diving into one of history's most tempting what-if scenarios. You've got a time machine, you know exactly when and where President Kennedy will be shot, and you have the power to change everything. But should you? The answer might shock you because sometimes the most heroic act is doing absolutely nothing at all. November 22, 1963, 12:30 p.m., Dealey Plaza, Dallas. You're standing in the crowd watching the presidential motorcade approach. You know that in exactly 90 seconds, shots will ring out from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. You could scream a warning. You could tackle the president's car. You could even create a distraction. The question isn't whether you could save JFK. It's whether you should. Let's start with the obvious changes. If Kennedy lives, he serves out his first term and likely wins re-election in 1964. Lyndon Johnson never becomes president, which means the Great Society programs that lifted millions out of poverty might never exist. Medicare, Medicaid, federal aid to education all hanging in the balance because you decided to play hero. But here's where it gets really interesting. Kennedy was already planning to de-escalate American involvement in Vietnam. In October 1963, just weeks before his death, he signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, calling for the withdrawal of 1,000 military advisors by the end of the year. Johnson, on the other hand, massively escalated the conflict. So by saving Kennedy, you might actually prevent the Vietnam War as we know it, saving 58,000 American lives and over 1 million Vietnamese lives. Sounds good so far, right? But let's dig deeper into the political reality of 1963. Kennedy was walking a tightrope on civil rights. He had introduced the Civil Rights Act, but it was stalled in Congress, facing fierce opposition from Southern Democrats. Kennedy needed every political ally he could get, and he was moving cautiously to avoid fracturing the Democratic Party. Johnson, however, was a master of congressional politics. He knew exactly which arms to twist, which favors to call in, and which threats to make. Within months of taking office, he pushed through not just the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but later the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Without Johnson's political wizardry and the national sympathy following Kennedy's assassination, these landmark civil rights laws might have been delayed for years, maybe even decades. Think about what that means. Rosa Parks had sparked the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. The Little Rock Nine had faced down angry mobs in 1957. By 1963, the civil rights movement was reaching a boiling point. If meaningful legislation didn't pass soon, the peaceful protests led by Martin Luther King Jr. might have given way to something much more violent and chaotic. But the implications go far beyond domestic policy. Let's talk about the one issue that could have ended civilization itself: nuclear weapons. Kennedy had just navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis a year earlier, bringing the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been. His handling of that crisis established him as someone the Soviets could negotiate with, someone who understood the stakes of the nuclear age. Here's the terrifying part. Kennedy was planning to pursue joint space missions with the Soviet Union. In September 1963, he proposed to the United Nations that America and Russia go to the moon together. Can you imagine how different the Cold War would have been if instead of a space race we'd had space cooperation? The billions spent on competing missile programs could have been redirected. The paranoia and mistrust that defined the era might have given way to collaboration. Johnson, for all his domestic achievements, was far more hawkish on foreign policy. He believed in American military superiority and was skeptical of Soviet intentions. Under Johnson, the Cold War intensified. The arms race accelerated. Proxy wars in Africa, Asia, and Latin America became more brutal and more frequent. Now let's consider an even more chilling possibility. What if your intervention doesn't just save Kennedy, but creates a temporal paradox that makes things infinitely worse? What if the assassin, seeing their plan disrupted, decides to use a more devastating method? Instead of rifle shots, what if they resort to a bomb, killing not just the president but hundreds of innocent bystanders? Or consider this: Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't working alone according to many conspiracy theories. What if by preventing his shots you trigger a backup plan involving multiple shooters, turning Dealey Plaza into a massacre that makes the original assassination look like a minor incident? But here's the most disturbing scenario of all. What if Kennedy's survival leads to his downfall in an even more catastrophic way? Remember, Kennedy was dealing with serious health issues that were hidden from the public. He had Addison's disease, chronic back pain, and was taking a cocktail of medications that would make any modern doctor cringe. What if the stress of a second term, without the martyrdom that preserved his legacy, reveals these weaknesses? Imagine Kennedy collapsing during a crucial moment in the Cold War, perhaps during another missile crisis. The Soviet Union, seeing American weakness, might make a move that Kennedy's failing health prevents him from responding to effectively. The nuclear war that Kennedy's death actually prevented might become inevitable under these circumstances. There's another angle we haven't considered: the butterfly effect on American culture. Kennedy's assassination didn't just change politics. It changed the American psyche. The innocence of the early 1960s died in Dallas. The skepticism toward government, the conspiracy theories, the general cynicism that defined the late 60s and 70s, all stemmed from that moment when America lost its faith in Camelot. Without that trauma, does the counterculture movement of the 1960s happen the same way? Do the anti-war protests, the civil rights marches, the women's liberation movement gain the same momentum without the galvanizing effect of national tragedy? Sometimes social progress requires a catalyst, something so shocking that it forces people to question everything they believed. Here's what really should keep you awake at night. What if Kennedy's survival leads to his son, John F. Kennedy Jr., eventually becoming president? Sounds great, right? But what if this creates a political dynasty that becomes corrupt over time? What if the Kennedy mystique, instead of being preserved in amber by tragedy, becomes tarnished by decades of political scandals and poor decisions? The ripple effects extend beyond politics into technology and innovation. The space program received massive funding partly as a tribute to Kennedy's vision and partly as a way to honor his memory. Would a living Kennedy have maintained the same level of commitment to reaching the moon? Would the technological innovations that came from the Apollo program, innovations that gave us everything from computer chips to cordless tools, have happened on the same timeline? Consider this sobering thought. Every person born after November 22, 1963, might never exist in your altered timeline. The chaos and change following Kennedy's assassination led to different marriages, different career choices, different life paths for millions of people. By saving one life, you might be preventing the birth of the person who cures cancer, or invents clean energy, or writes the book that finally brings world peace. But perhaps the most haunting possibility is this: what if Kennedy was meant to die that day, not because of fate or destiny, but because his death was the lesser of two evils? What if the intelligence agencies knew something you don't? What if they discovered a plot by Kennedy to reveal classified information that would have destabilized the entire Western alliance? What if his assassination, horrible as it was, prevented something even worse? The more you examine this scenario, the more you realize that time travel isn't about heroism. It's about hubris. The assumption that you know better than history, that your intervention will make things better, might be the most dangerous assumption of all. Every action creates reactions. Every change cascades through time in ways you can't predict or control. So what would you do? Standing there in Dealey Plaza, knowing you could shout a warning, knowing you could tackle the gunman, knowing you could change everything with a single word, would you choose action or inaction? Would you trust your moral instincts or the wisdom of history? The terrifying truth is that we'll never know if saving JFK would have been an act of heroism or the biggest mistake in human history. And that uncertainty might be the most important lesson of all about the nature of time, choice, and consequence. Next week, we're exploring another impossible decision. What if you could go back and give Hitler art lessons? Would nurturing his creative side prevent World War II? Or would it just create an even more dangerous dictator with better propaganda skills? Make sure you're subscribed because that story will challenge everything you think you know about preventing historical atrocities. What do you think? Would you save JFK or let history take its course? Let me know in the comments below, and remember, sometimes the hardest choice is choosing not to act at all.